Welcome to another edition of the Livestock Conservancy podcast, a special celebrating 250 edition. This month, we're talking about heritage goats in American history, and as always, we have a panel of experts that we're looking to learn from about goats, their role in the development of our nation, and why they're still important. And so, we're going to start by letting each of our panelists introduce themselves, kind of tell you their background and history with livestock, particularly with goats. And then we'll dive in and kind of get to the meat of the subject, if we will. Emily, let's start with you.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm Emily Pennington. I'm the livestock manager at Conner Prairie in Fishers, Indiana. We represent or work on preserving livestock that would have been around in the mid 1800s, specifically for Indiana, which is why we have the Arapawa goats. And then I am also the president of the Arapawa Goat Breeders Association.
Perfect. Dr. Browning, let us learn a little bit about you.
Okay. My name is Richard Browning, and I'm an animal scientist at Tennessee State University. We're located in Nashville, which is in Middle Tennessee. And my area of research is in breed evaluations. We do small scale beef cattle, and for over 20 years we've been doing meat goat breeds. We've studied pretty much all of the primary meat goat breeds over that time, including the Myotonic goats and the Spanish goats, which are have shown some really interesting outcomes in terms of performance and fitness compared to some of the other commercial breeds that we've studied. So look forward to visiting with you all on this work as we kind of work through the podcast.
Very good. We're looking forward to that too. And of course, we want to introduce Aaron Link to everybody. Aaron, tell us about you.
Hi, I am Erin Link. I am located in Western Wisconsin and have been raising San Clemente Island goats since 2013. And there's been a lot of different quests with these goats, different adventures, but currently I'm working on line breeding or a tepper line preservation with them and having fun with some cashmere collection to see what I can do with it in the future. But it's a never-ending projects with these goats, and it's fun.
Perfect. Well, we're excited about what we're going to learn today. And I want to just throw this out there as we talk about the history of America. We talk about 250 years of our nation and even pre-colonial times. And we look at livestock. I think a lot of folks think about horses, they think about maybe cattle. I'm not sure goats comes to mind. But goats have been a significant animal when it comes to American history. Can somebody kind of explain the role of goats in American history?
Sure. Well, when we think of the first explorers that come to what was called the New World, the Western Hemisphere, goats were included in the cadre of livestock that were brought over, and as a source of meat, source of milk, and for fiber. And oftentimes, I said one of the things that one of the areas of research that we do is with meat goats, and Spanish goats are one of those that we talk about, and I often, ask people, have they really heard of Spanish goats? And a lot of them have not. Then when I ask them, have they heard of longhorn cattle? They've all heard of Texas longhorn cattle. And so what I tell them, just take a magic marker, scratch out longhorn, put in Spanish goat, and you've got your history. So they've been part of livestock management, you know, since the first explorers, came over, and they've had a kind of an uneven role over the centuries in the United States in terms of their importance, whether we're talking fiber, dairy, or meat, which has been, meat has been our focus. But yeah, they played an important role all the way, back to the beginning. One of the things that I have shared with folks, talking not that it's a heritage breed, but we're talking about the westward expansion, from the 13 colonies, and goats were an important part of that expansion, that west movement, and a lot of it was because of the value of goats in clearing land. You read some of the history of like Angora goats, and you'll see where people just realize, hey, these goats could be used to actually open up brush and actually open up space that we can run sheep and run cattle. So goats have played a really important role, not only in those important aspects of commodity production, but also in some of these other services such as land clearing.
I guess if you were to market, goats are not just a triple purpose kind of animal, but have multiple purposes beyond what we think of, right, Aaron?
I agree. I have in the past used goats for as much as I can on my farmstead, offering meat shares, learning how to tan hides or doing that piece of them, cashmere collection, even, learning how to clean skulls and offering that as a decorative piece for people to use as well. Um, Plus milk, of course, and all the products you can make with the milk from them. So they're definitely a really excellent multi-purpose breed that are easy to handle that you don't necessarily need big equipment for. I get nervous. I grew up around cows, Holsteins mainly, and the equipment that you have to have if you have issues with that cow, if it's sick, all of that stuff, I can pick up a goat for the most part and take it somewhere or handle it for the most part. So I really enjoy goats for that reason. They're multi-purpose and fairly easy to handle.
Emily, is the multi-purpose factor of goats why they would have been important to homesteaders in the Midwest, particularly in Indiana, during the 19th century?
Yeah, for sure. And with them being smaller, they were a great resource to like train young people, kids on like draft power. So that was another type of way for goats to be utilized. One of the unfortunate things for us specifically with like central Indiana agriculture in the mid 1800s is there really isn't a lot of documentation of goats in this area. We know that there were goats, but we think either the goats were too rambunctious to be noteworthy in a lot of people's diaries, or they hadn't quite been influencing drastically in our area, unlike the cattle, the like shorthorns. Those are really talked about in the mid 1800s. But we know, with Plymouth Plantation, or what was formerly known as Plymouth Plantation, they brought the Arapaws to their village specifically because of the description of goats that were coming over. And with the Arapaws, they fit that for their time period. So, yeah.
Okay. This is probably a great time to talk about the individual breeds. So, Emily, you've mentioned Arapawa. Let's talk about them a little bit. What makes them unique? What are their characteristics? Why are they a good fit for some homesteaders and farmers?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Arapaw goats are a New Zealand breed. Captain James Cook most likely took them from South Africa down to Arapawa Island. And they were imported into the United States in the early 1900s, specifically because of their descriptors for Plymouth Plantation. Now, though, there's about 600 worldwide, so they are very, very rare. There's about 300 here in the United States and 300 over in New Zealand. The goats that were in the UK have unfortunately died out or been crossed out and no longer pure. But they're amazing mothers. I barely have to touch any kiddings, and when I do, most of the time it's a first timer. They regularly throw twins. We even have quite a few triplets. They are phenomenal when it comes to clearing out brush. Our bucks, that's their job throughout the spring and summer when we're not breeding. They just get to go through and kind of clean out our fence lines. And then within the last 2 years, we've started milking some of them. And while they don't produce a high quantity of milk, some of our does, though, even while they're still feeding their kids, are giving us a pint of milk, which is enough for some families where they don't need, as much as like a sawing goat produces. We've been able to utilize that for soap and lotion at Connor Prairie and have been selling that to the public, kind of educating our guests in a different way outside of eating animals, because we do talk about like consuming our livestock quite a bit, but being able to find other ways to utilize them has been quite great.
Mhm. Mhm. And of course, that breed's on the critically listed on the conservation priority list. Um, What can we do to increase their numbers?
Yeah, so currently, our numbers have stayed pretty consistent over the last 5 to 10 years, where we've been, yeah, sitting around the 300 mark, but we've been really trying to branch out to find more breeders. We find that a lot of people want to get into the breed because of how rare they are, but then they only stay breeders for 2 to 3 years before they realize, oh, I'm not going to make a bunch of money off these goats. So we've been trying to work more with the breeders that we have right now to give them the resources that they need to also reach out to more breeders that want to stay in this long term. Um, there's breeders all the way from as far west as Washington State, as far north as Wisconsin. We had some breeders in Florida and North Carolina. So we are quite spread out across the United States. So there's a lot of opportunities to get on people's waiting lists to bring in some goats or even get some extra bucklings and wether them to use as fresh conservation.
Okay, very good. Aaron, you're also raising a critically endangered breed of goat. Tell me about your animals.
Yeah, when I started raising the San Clemente breed in 2013, I think there were about 400 or 450 of them left in both. They are in Canada and the United States. And current day, I think the population is about 1,700 in both Canada and the United States. So it's a growing population, which is pretty wonderful. And they were awfully hard to get a hold of at first. And I just happened to go on Craigslist when I was interested, and there was somebody 3 hours away in Minnesota that had their herd for sale randomly. Everybody else was states away. So that was fun. From my understanding, the San Clemente Island goat breed likely descended from the Santa Catalina goats, and those goats were moved to the San Clemente Island around the in 1875, and they were left on that island to go do their goaty stuff. They were left there as a food resource for people coming through in the future. So that's again, like goats are, little horned rabbits, I guess, with how quickly they can populate. And so in I think it's 1980, in that roundabout way, they were, viewed as an invasive species on the island, which, yep, they definitely were. And so they were starting to be eradicated on the island, and there were different nonprofits and groups that saved those goats from being exterminated completely. So and that's where that foundation group of animals started, was this from these different organizations saving them.
Okay. And Richard, you mentioned Spanish goats. Let's talk about that breed, which is recovering on the conservation priority list, and some of the unique things about Spanish goats.
Yes, we started studying Spanish goats back in 2002, and at the time, meat goats were really, growing in popularity as a animal industry for a lot of producers that are looking for alternatives to our traditional livestock. And at the time, there wasn't a lot of information, a lot of research information, objective, evidence-based information on how various breeds of meat goat um, perform, particularly in the South, in the Southeast. And we started studying Boer goats and Kiko goats. And at the time, Boer goats were seen as the pretty much the gold standard. And Spanish goats were seen as kind of an afterthought and really not important, not going to be an important player in meat goat production. And everybody was crossing their Spanish goats with Boer goats to improve performance. That was the plan. And then we started, doing this research, and we put together a herd of Spanish goats. And at the time, there was no breed association. You just have to kind of go out and visit with folks and find out who had Spanish goats, and most of them were in Texas. And within a short period of time, we started to realize that these Spanish goats actually have some performance attributes that were superior to what was supposed to have been the gold standard breed, which was the Boer goat. And a lot of folks couldn't believe that was the case. And with that, we started, advising producers that, hey, you need to take a second look at Spanish goats because they actually have some performance attributes that would be beneficial in a commercial meat goat production setting. And over time, there's been more and more producers that have incorporated Spanish goats in their meat goat production systems. There's been at least one or two breed associations that have been established over the last few years to really start, maintaining pure lines of Spanish goats. But Spanish goats have become one of our foundation populations for future studies, further studies on various meat goat breeds. Now we've studied Boer goats and Kiko goats. More recently, we've studied Savannah goats and Myotonic goats. And the Spanish goats have always performed very well in terms of reproductive performance, in terms of kid performance, and even some of the carcass work that we did, a few years back, that the Spanish goats, although they did not look like they would do well on a carcass study, they perform very well compared to Boer goats and the Kiko goats. And so I always advise producers that if they want to do commercial production, Spanish goat should be one that should really be considered as a base breed for the doe herd. Now we can take and breed those Spanish does to any other breed of goat, depending on what your production objectives are. But in terms of having a commercial herd for meat goat production, Spanish goats are ones that I always recommend producers take a look at.
Okay. We have a couple other breeds on the conservation priority list, and I'm hoping somebody would be able to speak a little bit about Oberhasli goats. Anybody have any expertise or experience with that particular breed?
So I don't have a lot of experience with them, but we do have two very lovely Obers on our property. Um, and while we haven't had them long, we did decide we were going to phase out our Saanens because we like to have the Saanens and the Arapawas to kind of compare and contrast for the guests to a modern dairy goat versus, a more historic goat. And after a little bit, we were like, well, we're here conserving rare breeds. Why don't we get into a rare breed dairy goat? So we have only done two lactations for my older doe, but the Obers are so amazingly sweet. I have nothing but high praises for these goats, and they do phenomenal. We tend to leave the kids on the dams and then pull them overnight and milk the next day. The milk is an amazing color. They keep great condition, even with raising a kid and being hand milked for us. And truly, if someone wants to get into a dairy goat, those are the ones that I'm going to be kind of gearing people towards with the attitude, with the demeanor, with the milk production that we've been getting. They have just been a phenomenal go for us.
Very good. I think a lot of folks would agree with that. And of course, Dr. Browning, you mentioned myotonic goats, and those are very unique and very popular and are super close to graduating off of the conservation priority list as they're recovering. Tell us about some of the unique aspects of this goat, which is also known as the Tennessee fainting goat, which a lot of folks may know it by that name.
Yeah, they go by a whole list of different names, nervous goats, scared goats, wooden leg goats. There's a whole host of names that are attached to myotonic goats or fainting goats. I think the more common popular name are fainting goats, which they actually don't faint like the name indicates. They actually have this paralysis of their muscles whenever they get stressed. It could be a positive or negative stressor, but they'll kind of stiffen up for a few seconds and then they'll kind of come out of it. The research that we've done with myotonic goats has revealed a real interesting aspect. And one thing I'll note about myotonic goats, this stiffening of the muscle is caused by a single gene that's mutated that affects their ability for muscles to relax after they become stiff, and it takes them a few seconds to kind of overcome that and go on about their business, so to speak. And older goats have learned how to kind of brace themselves and position themselves so they don't fall over. Young goats haven't figured it out yet, so they will actually fall down and just kind of lay on their sides until they kind of come out of that state of paralysis, if you will. But one thing that we found out about these goats, one of the the real problems that we have with raising meat goats, probably goats in general, but certainly meat goats in the Southeast is internal parasites are a major obstacle. And I'll tell folks that parasites have probably run more people out the goat business than anything, at least here in the Southeast. And one thing that we notice is in all the studies that we've conducted where we look at internal parasite burdens in animals, is that these myotonic goats always seem to have lower parasite burdens, lower, worm counts or worm egg counts than even our Spanish goats and our Kiko goats. And the Kiko goats and our Spanish goats have been our standard, and the myotonic goats have been, a lot lower than them, significantly lower in some of these studies. We're not sure why. We kind of speculated on some things, but that's something that's unique about the myotonic goat from a production and fitness perspective. Now, folks like myotonic goats because they're not as likely to jump out of fences. And talking about catching a goat, they're really easy to catch if they have a fainting episode, so to speak. And one of the stories that you hear, which I don't think anybody does this anymore, is that back in the day when people were running a lot of sheep, that they would have a fainting goat or two out with the sheep, and the fainting goats actually protected the sheep because if a predator got in there, they would get the goat before they got the sheep, but the sheep would run away. I don't think anybody does that anymore, but you hear stories about that's one of the purposes of people having myotonic goats is to protect their more valuable livestock.
I want to
Now,
touch on for folks who may not be familiar with these goats that episode, that fainting, if you will, does no harm to the animal. In fact, it actually serves a beneficial purpose, right?
yeah. From a production perspective, that we still need to get some research done to see, how much of a benefit we get. And we're thinking in terms of muscle development. Because if you look at a myotonic goat, they have this really, particularly those that have aged a little bit and have gone through, all these episodes of muscle contraction is almost like a bodybuilder. And they get these really well-defined muscles, particularly the long muscles. And it's thought that because of that they will produce a carcass that has more lean tissue, and maybe a higher dress out than some of our other goats that do not have that condition and don't have that muscle development. We did some research a few years ago, but I haven't analyzed the data yet to see if there was any difference in carcass, if that carcass merit for any of these animals. We have a project going on right now that's active that's looking at myotonics in a crossbreeding program to see if that level of internal parasite burden or the advantage of that in these myotonic goats, if it's carried on at some level in the crossbred goats. Because one of the things about the myotonic goats, they are a small goat. They're not as large as our other meat goat breeds, and so that's one of the things that people really don't like about them. So we can get a larger crossbred animal that will still have a lower level of internal parasite burden or load that it might be beneficial. And a lot of people that raise myotonics, they raise them for pets. They like them just as companion animals, or just, they're certainly an interesting conversation piece. And you probably see a lot of YouTube videos about fainting goats, myotonic goats, and people out there spooking them, and they all fall down like somebody has just kind of pushed them over. But they're a real interesting animal. And when we started building a myotonic herd, it was real challenging because one of the things that people would ask us was if we were going to eat the goats, or are you going to actually harvest the goats? And some people will advertise myotonic goats, but they do not sell to folks that are raising meat goats because they want their goats to go someplace where they're going to be like, pampered and petted and that sort of thing. So myotonic goats are real interesting. And being in Middle Tennessee, they had their history kind of starts here in Middle Tennessee, in Marshall County, in Lewisburg. And so one of the names for them are the Tennessee meat goat. That's another name that kind of goes along with the myotonic, with Tennessee meat goats, because they've got this origin here in Middle Tennessee.
Very good. Aaron, from your perspective, what makes goats, particularly those goats that are on the conservation priority list, a good choice for homesteaders, producers, operators, that kind of thing? Why goats?
Again, I think it comes back to their multi-purpose nature and small size for handling. There is that piece of fencing and goats being a big hiccup, but I do highly suggest people do some pasture walks or visit other farms regarding like good fencing setups for goats. They're not, I have net fence and some perimeter fence, and I don't have breakouts hardly at all. Um, I think those are really the main reasons. They're also this really sweet. They have personalities that are adorable. They're great to work with too. So you can, you know, as Emily had suggested, like they're great for younger people to work with, to do positive reinforcement training. There's so many fun things that you can do with them. Like for myself, I'm getting ready to bring some weather goats out for winter holiday things, and they have little jingle bells and stuff on them. Like the imagination that you can have with them is endless. There's so many fun things that you can do with them. On top of production too. Like I definitely have freezer camp, and again, like I've offered meat shares in the past as well. So they're just wonderful. They're there for everything.
And Emily, what has made goats such a big piece of the nation's agricultural development? I mean, why were they so important, in the time frame that you worked to show to guests and even before?
I do think that being able to utilize them for the multi-purpose has been a great way to, really push them more toward like more through agriculture. They did really start gaining popularity in the later 1800s, especially as people started to do more industrial work with agriculture. We're kind of moving more towards feedlots and dairies. And that's really when I feel like the dairy goats and the meat goats started to really kick off in the United States. But that's also when, breeds that are similar to the Arapawa goats ended up falling to the wayside because they weren't as high producers. And people wanted to try to produce as much as they could on as minimal input as possible. But little did they realize that some of these smaller goat breeds, while they can't necessarily produce, 2 gallons of milk a day, they're still completely usable and they're great for other purposes like the parasite resistance. And they're good for, not having to put 6 foot tall fencing for some breeds, not the Arapaws. They will jump over your fence if they really feel like it. But they have been just very influential, I feel like, especially as people did start moving more west towards like California, because there was all the different types of brush and terrain.
Why should a producer or homesteader today consider agriculture? I mean, consider goats as a part of their animal husbandry program. Are goats a viable option for producers?
I, as a person that might have a small chunk of land that wants a multi-purpose animal that this is providing for themselves, I think they're great. As a person that ran a farm business doing this stuff, it's always, I mean, it's a bigger question of farming and all of those complicated nuanced pieces with it. It can be great for production. I think like San Clemente's could be, any goat could be good for production. um I think a really big piece that would be a profitable avenue to look into as well is using them as biological land management, and doing a business like that. That's also a piece that I did in the big mishmash of a farm business, was renting goats out. And it takes a lot of, you need to know about land more than what I did, but I knew the basics. And the goats were phenomenal at this eating. That was even something, like I had family members that grew up on farms. I was practicing my goat rental business on their properties, and they were stunned at how they just ate 24/7. They're just like, do they stop? And I'm like, they probably do, but they're having a great time eating all of your invasive buckthorn or whatever it is. So that people are just like stunned at. Like they're just these little eating machines, and that's really fabulous to see. I wasn't graining my goats for many years either. They were just all hay or pasture or browse fed. So, and they had good body conditions.
Dr. Browning, why should a farmer look to diversify with goats? Is it a good addition to an existing farm business?
Sure, depending on where you're located and your infrastructure setup. One thing about goats, they do require some unique infrastructure, particularly in terms of fencing and shelter. You have to keep that in mind. And certainly speaking on the production side of it, goats are a really good complement to cattle or any other livestock. They're unique in their feeding habits. And we talk about the multi-purpose aspects of goats, and certainly the the clearing aspect, the browse clearing aspect is something that's really beneficial if you're trying to get to more of a natural production system, where you want to avoid chemicals and that sort of thing. Talking about clearing fence lines, which clearing opening up new space that you can have grass for grazing livestock. Goats are really a good addition, save you from chemicals and using tractors to bush hog. Goats will open up a lot of land. The other thing about meat goats from a production perspective is we don't produce enough goat meat to meet demand here. There's a great opportunity. We have, according to census numbers, we only have a couple million meat goats in the United States across all breeds, but a couple million. And we import the equivalent of about 1 million goats every year because although goat meat consumption isn't a big thing in the United States, overseas it's a big deal, and with a very diverse and growing diverse population of consumers in the United States, there's a growing demand for goat meat. So there's an opportunity there for folks that are looking for an alternative means of producing animal source protein to add goats and to provide this product that's otherwise is being supplied by imports. The challenge is picking the right goats and to do it where you can raise these goats to produce carcasses, but do so sustainably. And that's always been the challenge, is being able to. It's like that for a lot of other livestock, but particularly for goats, doing it in such a way that you can actually make money. And we've had a lot of folks that have asked us over the years, can you make money raising goats? And I have these numbers that I show folks that, with Spanish goats, we were turning a profit on those goats. And the funny thing I tell producers, we were turning a profit and we weren't even trying to make money. We were just doing the research and we decided to do the economics. We were losing money. We were losing a lot of money with our Bordeaux, but with our Spanish does, we actually had about 8 to 10% return on investment on those goats. And so, yeah, you can raise meat goats. There's a demand for goat meat that's already there. And it's just a matter of, having the right production system. And for us, it starts with having the right genetics and to produce, like I said earlier, Spanish goats are a really good start in terms of developing a meat goat production system, or even if you want to use them for land clearing or some of these other, side purposes, goats are a really good addition. Like I said, they're not competing with cattle, they're not competing with sheep for grazing, for forages, for browse. So they're a really good complement, but you have to have the right facilities. Otherwise, it's going to be an uphill battle to keep these goats going and, for the long term.
Mhm. Emily, Dr. Browning mentioned the economics. What are you hearing from your members as a leader in a breed association? Are your members saying yes, it's a profitable endeavor?
I would say at the moment, since we are so small in numbers, we're still trying to figure out what sort of profitability can come in from the Arapaw specifically. And I know a lot of people who want to get into the breed tend to kind of step back a little bit, especially when they see the price tag that comes with the goats. Like, typically I sell a doeling for $550. And some people go, well, why would I do that if I could go to the sale barn and get a goat kid for $200? And I'm like, well, you're buying the genetics behind it. You're buying the fact that you know that we have been using some of like the imported semen from New Zealand, or we've been using genetics that was imported, and now these are like kids out of them that's been saved genetically through the Smithsonian. Um, but we're like trying to, as an association, come up with the numbers of where the profitability is. And most likely, what I'm going to assume, we're going to end up finding that profitability with the meat. It's not going to be through the sales of your breeding stock. A lot of people seem to think that that's going to be where it is, but also utilizing our bucks, which obviously we have a surplus of, within different production systems, because we can utilize the Arapawa bucks on, Bordeaux's. And we're producing smaller kids, but then you got your boar goat who can produce a nice meaty kid. And it's still a way to kind of find a way to use these surplus animals, still be productive, but not necessarily influencing the Arapawa population. As we do continue to grow our numbers, I feel like as we start hitting 500, 600 goats within the United States, we're going to be able to really start seeing where the profitability is with these goats.
Okay. And Aaron, I'm sure you can tell me that for those producers who want to use the multi-purpose aspects of an SCI goat, for example, there's an opportunity, as you said, to market everything from skulls to milk, right?
Hmm. Definitely. I'm coming from my personal experience, and I'm trying to think of other breeders who do a business with them, and I can't think of anybody offhand. But one thing that did pop into my head that I think people do kind of use them for is agritourism as well, like as another, like, hey, I have like an Airbnb or whatever that is, like, and look at I mean, goats all around are this wonderful to watch and are an attraction for people. um I think there are those conversations about this, like people feeling conflicted about using a critically endangered goat as meat too. But there is always that, like, I have plenty of wethers that don't belong in any program, or they don't belong in my management because they're being sassy. And we need to do different things with them. And that is where I think if people are feeling hesitant about, using them in meat production, that is like biological land management or all of those other things are really different avenues that they can use as well. But I don't know where things are going to grow with the population or how people will utilize them in the future. I would like to see people doing all of the things with them and doing them well, but it's still business and it's still farming and it's complicated. And I'm hopeful for their future that we can find all these profitable uses for them and enjoy them as well as what they are too. So
That's a good answer. And I want to turn to Dr. Browning because Dr. Browning is a former board member of the Livestock Conservancy, and I want him to address that issue you raised when folks say, "Well, these are endangered animals, and why should we eat them?" How do you respond to that?
Well, if you have a small, and all these breeds have different inventory census numbers that some folks may say, well, we shouldn't consume the animals or we shouldn't use them for production. The first thing that comes to mind is that it's going to be the production that's going to really allow for these animals to find greater use to where they could be used and expand in numbers, like we're seeing with the Spanish goats. And we'll probably see that with some of these other breeds as well. So if you have a breeding group of animals, and most of them are going to be does, so we're talking about goats, you're not necessarily going to be consuming your breeding animals unless they're animals that aren't productive to begin with. So you have to have a productive animal. If you have animals that are infertile, then they're of no real value to the breed to begin with. But on top of that, even if you're raising dairy does or meat goats, what have you, you can breed those does and get a percentage of those animals that could be used for production. And I think somebody mentioned earlier about having, half of all your kids are going to be males, and we don't need all those males. And so you are for on the meat side, you have all those animals that are not going to contribute to the gene pool anyhow, and that's a source of income by selling those animals. And you can even take like our Spanish goats. We'll take a proportion of our goats and we'll crossbreed them for the intent purpose of producing market animals that can be consumed. And so it's really all about showing producers that these breeds can be used in a commercial setting. And certainly with does, their production is not based on them being harvested anyhow. They're going to be milked. And then any males that are going to be produced will go for meat production anyhow. So I think it's one of the things where we want to let folks know that, hey, by using these animals for milk or for meat or for fiber, if you're producing mohair cashmere off these animals, that you are actually doing more to save them than you would by just keeping them someplace isolated and they're not being used to a point where more people will want to use them. Because I think the example was given that if I've got goats, they're going to cost me money. I've got to generate some revenue off these animals, or I can't keep them, unless I've just got money to burn. So you have to find ways, whether use them to produce kids for meat, or you're able to get them out for land clearing, for land management, or for dairy, or if saving these animals or showing that they're useful and you can make money with these animals. That's really the key, is showing that yes, I can have a Spanish goat or a Myotonic goat and I can make money raising them. And then that's going to generate the interest. That's going to generate, like the Spanish goats. Now we've got two breed associations out there, and more people are getting into Spanish goats because they're realizing you can actually make money raising these animals. And that's going to increase the interest and increase the inventory. And then you've got these goats that are about to graduate off because you've got a number of breeders that are now increasing the size of the populations.
Mhm. Emily, I saw you nodding in agreement with Dr. Browning.
Yeah, I just feel like everything he's talking about really is just something I feel like we're having to push for, especially with just talking to our guests or even our breeders with the association, is like we have to find this purpose for them, because as we find the purpose, more people are going to want to get into these goats, and the more people who we can move different genetics to, we can continue to like focus on specific genetic lines. We can still get those numbers to figure out what works, what doesn't, how's the best way to feed these goats out, where's the money, what's the sweet spot to process them. So I feel like we're all on the same page about what is needed with these goats.
And this would probably be a great opportunity for me to do a commercial, if you will, for our website, which is livestockconservancy.org. And there you can find resources, including profiles of each of the breeds we've talked about. There's a goat selection chart that folks can use to say, well, it kind of compares temperament and size and needs of each of these breeds, as well as a bunch of other resources to help folks in choosing what species of animal to raise on their farm or homestead, or even what individual breed within a species. And again, that's livestockconservancy.org. Also, I would point out that if you go to livestockconservancy.org/250, you can find all of our other resources regarding the Celebrating 250 campaign as we look at heritage breeds and flocks in American history, including a great goat-related blog post that Emily Hayes from our board, one of Dr. Browning's proteges, has written about the history of some of these breeds and why they're important. But that kind of leads me into a question for you, Aaron. As folks are thinking about maybe I want to enter into goat production, what should they be considering when they're trying to decide, what factors are involved when they try to decide whether or not to raise goats and which breed to pursue?
Yeah, I'll start that off by saying I've talked far more people out of getting into the breed or goats than I like being honest and upfront. I think that's really important because that sets people up for success. And so some things you really want to think about, let's say specifically with the San Clemente breed, is the short and long-term goals. Like why do you want them or any goat? And what are your goals with them, and what do you need set up to achieve those goals? And then looking at your property, what infrastructure you have set up already. And I really, if people can, I highly suggest doing pasture walks and visiting other farms to see other setups. I've told, I've suggested to many people that, like, just because you see a setup that you like doesn't mean that that will work 100% on your farm. It's just another tool in your toolbox that you can use as you look at other people's infrastructure and setup. And then I suggest having also, like, people or producers come to your property. Like, I had a TSP person come out to help me create a pasture management plan to, like, interseed different stuff for my goats and, like, what all these plans were. Because my brain's only so big. I can't know everything. And so I appreciate resources out there and other people that are willing to help. So definitely ask for that help. But yeah, I think those are some things to consider. And then, of course, putting up, like, making sure you have adequate water year round. People will sometimes not think about, like, I'm in Western Wisconsin, we get -20, chunks of temperature for like months on end, and the water piece is a big deal. Um, and think about how your feeding system will look like year round, and making sure you have the things that you need to, like, maneuver around, obstacles that can come up because of weather. And your housing is good for your goats, depending on what region you live in. And then, of course, there's the fencing piece, and making sure that you do have good fencing for your animals. And training animals to fencing, I think, is important, depending on, what you have. And being really honest, like, let's say you're like, I'm prepared, you got your group of goats. And then there's that management piece of, like, some of these goats aren't fitting into my management system that I have. You, I think it's really important to make sure these animals fit into your system. Otherwise, you're going to be struggling all of the time. And that's why I talked about culling, certain goats, because they were being jerks, basically. And they need to move on, because they can teach goats bad habits, or maybe there's some temperament issues that are possibly genetic, all of these other things. So it is us making these goals, and finding mentors too, I think, is really important, and just asking for help and receiving that feedback, instead of kind of putting up a barrier against the feedback about something that you might really, really want. And just making sure you're well prepared, because we love to see people succeed with the animal breed or whatever you have, rather than, be like, oh no, like, this thing didn't work, and the animals have to move on, and people have a bad taste in their mouth, possibly, about the breed or the, species and stuff.
Mhm.
So yeah, long, but those are my thoughts.
Okay. Aaron, Emily, anything to add to those suggestions?
I think looking at realistically the finances that people have when considering goats is an important thing, because you might not think about it. Most goats, I feel like, are pretty good at taking care of themselves, but do you have the ability to go to a vet? Can you have a vet come out to you? There's a lot of people that I know who are into goats who have no way of transporting an animal to an emergency hospital if they have a dystocia that requires a C-section, or they're not prepared necessarily for the price of hay, which continues to go up. And so I feel like people who can talk to other breeders and be like, "Hey, realistically, what is your financial, viewpoint over this?" And just starting to kind of get this information together, knowing that right away you're not going to make money off of goats. It's just the truth of any livestock breed. It takes a while, but I feel like if people end up having the ability to be mentored and to listen to other people, that really does set them up for success, because they get realistic expectations. Other things that I feel like people should consider is how involved they want to be with the breed associations. At bare minimum, if you have a rare breed goat, be a member, register your animals. That's absolutely important, because there's several people who, unfortunately, I've seen be set up for failure because they purchase goats and the people say, well, they're purebred, and so they assume then that it can be registered, and they become upset when it's like, well, we have no record of the goat. We have no record of their parents, unfortunately, or we have records of great great grandparents, but how do we know realistically that this is still a genetic prodigy from that combination? So I feel like making sure people know that we are helping the breed by having registered animals is really important, or working with the breed association to see if those animals can be registered. And especially with us, we kind of say within 6 to 12 months, you should get them registered because we require photos of the goats to go with them. Just making sure that that time frame kind of stays in the back of your mind. And actually, for us, submitting those photos, because a lot of goats that have been lost within our population have reappeared, and we've been able to verify from the markings of the Arapaws that that is the goat with the pedigree. So we've been able to bring animals back into the registry that way.
And we have a full list of breed associations on our website as well that folks can find any breed association or breed club that works with heritage breeds. So, Dr. Browning, let's wrap up with this. As you look into your crystal ball, what's the future of these heritage breed goats?
Well, based on what we've seen with the Myotonics and Spanish, where both of those have growing populations and growing numbers of producers that are raising them, I think that the future is pretty good. Folks are looking for alternative ways of raising animals. We got more and more new people that are coming in that are on smaller and smaller units, acres of land, smaller ranches and farms and farmettes, and goats are a really good fit. And goats are a little bit different than the other livestock species because they're not it's not a large industry to begin with. And so there's a lot of room for any one of these heritage breeds, whether they're fiber, dairy, or meat, to really have an impact on what we're talking about earlier in terms of trying to meet consumer demand for these products that we're not producing enough of in this country. And certainly everything that Emily and Aaron said are correct. When we get to the finances, and we have folks that are coming in all the time, and really you have to, just like with any other livestock, you've got to keep your costs down. Um, there aren't any large margins with raising goats, just like with any other livestock, and you can kind of shoot any profit that you could have had just by your startup costs. Because even for starting up an operation, you want to kind of keep those costs low. Your fencing, your shelter. I always tell folks you cannot raise goats like they're cows because that's not going to work. We've had producers that come in, they got this land, they want to put goats on. The first thing you want to do is bush hog it all down and plant grass. I said, no, that's not how you do goats. What you have, for what I tell folks, the rougher the better for goats. They like browse. So leave that. That's the strength of goats. So they can use land that is not really in some big pasture setup. That's what you want. Is you want some rough land. You want browse. If you don't have, I tell folks, if you don't have browse, you may want to consider something else, because it's going to be difficult to raise these goats, particularly if you're going to run them in such a way that you can hopefully turn a profit on those animals per animal on a per acre basis. I think the other thing that, parasite management is certainly going to be important if you're going to stay in the business long term. Another thing that some people don't keep in mind, I don't think it's been brought up, outside of parasites, probably the other big issue is predator control. You have to have predator control, and we've had folks that have gotten into the business, and within a year or two, they tell us that some dogs or coyotes just wiped them out, and fencing isn't often going to be the lone solution to predator control. And so there's different options for that. That's going to be another expense that you have to kind of factor into your economic setup. But in terms of the future, there's a lot of opportunity. People are looking for alternative animal source proteins and different animal industries to kind of participate in, and goats, kind of fit that bill. Like I said, the market is already there, particularly for goat meat. It's just a matter of being able to raise these animals sustainably. And like what we're seeing with the Spanish goats and the Myotonic goats, there's certainly a bright future for these, and these heritage breeds are going to certainly play a role in the future of all these goat industries in the United States.
Perfect. Well, that's a great summation and a great way to wrap up. I want to thank Aaron and Richard and Emily all for joining us this afternoon for another edition of the Celebrating 250 edition of the Livestock Conservancy podcast. Thank you to each of you. We invite all of you to learn more about heritage breed goats, find out the breed associations, look at some of the resources on our website, and we invite you to join us again next month where we'll explore another heritage breed species. For the Livestock Conservancy, I'm Les Odell. We'll see you next month.